welcome back for our third and final day of the 7th Annual South Asian Media and Cultural Studies Conference. I am Rebecca Peters, a member of the organizing committee and a PhD candidate in the Department of Religion here at Florida State University. Today's first panel will include a keynote address by Professor Shakuntala Banerjee. For those of you viewing on YouTube live stream, welcome. Please feel free to drop questions into the chat feature on YouTube at any time. We'll compile them and ask as many as possible to our speaker during the Q&A. Now I would like to welcome Dr. Kelly Kelly, teaching faculty at the School of Communication and the College of Communication and Information at Florida State University, to introduce the speaker. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Rebecca. Well, welcome. Welcome to day 3 of the 7th South Asian Media and Cultural Studies Conference. It's really a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be here on the final stretch of a great lineup with Dr. Shakuntala Banerjee. Dr. Banerjee is a professor of media, culture, and social change and program director for the Master of Science program in Media, Communication, and Development at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She lectures in development and communication, international media, and world cinema, and is the winner of the 4th European Prize for Excellence in Teaching in the Humanities and Social Sciences, awarded by Central European University in Hungary. She has participated in several large cross-European projects. She was the UK project director of a multi-country Horizon 2020 project on youth citizenship in Europe and principal investigator for a collaborative grant with American University Sharjah on young people's participatory culture, the internet, and creative production in the Middle East. She led one of 20 WhatsApp grants for investigating the spread of mediated misinformation among publics in India. And she is part of media at LSE's project on representation and COVID in international media, with a new project on social media incitement and disinformation launching this month. She is the author of numerous books, including Reading Bollywood, South Asian Media Cultures, Children and Media in India among them. In 2020, she co-edited a volume, Youth Active Citizenship Across Europe, Ethnographies of Participation, and she is currently working on a co-authored volume of Social Media Hate, which will be released with Routledge in 2022. So Dr. Banerjee, it is a pleasure to be with you today. I look forward to your talk on disinformation across borders. Welcome.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you so much. And thank you all for inviting me. It must have been a wonderful 2 days, and I have had a chance to catch up with a few of the great presentations. I'm going to share my screen with you now so that you get a bit of a sense of the work we've been doing. And if anybody has any issues with seeing it, please pop that in the chat so that I can remedy that. Can you see my screen? Great. So today we're going to be talking about disinformation and misinformation across borders. And what this means for me personally is that I want to just preface what I say by saying most of my work has taken place in India, but I am interested in the contexts of all the other South Asian countries. I'm most interested, of course, in looking at the ways in which misinformation and disinformation are porous. The same sorts of tropes and ideas get used against different groups of people in different countries. So what might get focused against Balochis or Afghani refugees or against Rohingya in Pakistan or Bangladesh, the very same tropes are getting used against Indian Muslims and Christians. The same kinds of misinformation focus on women and women's rights in all of our South Asian contexts. They get slightly adapted, but usually you'll find at the core a certain central message which is used to either whip up or change particular forms of information and disinformation. So now I'm going to talk just briefly about the social context of disinformation spread in South Asia. And in doing so, I'm clearly going to reference the work of a lot of South Asian colleagues who've been working on this area for decades. But I didn't want this talk to be entirely theoretical. It focuses on a practical case study about disinformation across borders and what we can do about that. Therefore, the backdrop is largely, despite the many different theorizations of the social context, is largely moving towards an understanding of how disinformation is embedded in everyday life for people. So looking at the work that's coming out, particularly in Pakistan and India, there is certainly a connection between social media and neoliberal consumption, the ways in which TikTok can be used for romantic and travel reasons, to put together images of couples and to put together images of dance and clothing and gadgets, but also, of course, of online porn, is something which has been written about very well by numbers of colleagues. Everyday life in India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal is not an easy thing. It's not an easy thing for most people. It involves a lot of struggle, but it also involves a lot of caring, a lot of pedagogic pressure, festivals, and in amongst those, a lot of loving family. So when you get a message, it's not embedded in a context of suspicion and hate. Suspicion and hate is one of the forms in which othering and bonding of different groups takes place in the everyday life of people. And this is completely irrelevant of media. It can be just in a conversation between a grandparent and a grandchild about dating cultures, for instance, or it can be in a joke or a meme shared by a group of friends at high school, for instance. So everyday life is ongoing, and it is also the backdrop to some very specific types of misinformation. Around this, in the wider world, but also inside the family, on the streets and online, you have the growth of an aggressively patriarchal masculinity, which shows itself not only in the consumption of various forms of pornography, including pornography which has been made using the bodies of young women and girls in the localities in which the makers reside, but also international pornography and other forms of violent porn. But that's a side drop to the simple control of the body, which is regulated by families, both for young women and for young men, as well as for older women. And this constant control of the body, this sense of repression, I've written about elsewhere in my work on fiction, has the effect of turning people inwards towards their own communities, turning people away from outsiders and the other, and has, of course, seen its sort of apotheosis, if you like, in the latest round of laws against familial mixing, against intermarriage between communities, with the fears of conversion on their back. And then finally, we have a very vast gap between rich and poor, between the destitute and the very wealthy. And in the middle, a load of people who don't quite know where they fit. They don't know whether to identify as middle class when they actually are poor, or to identify with the very rich when they have absolutely nothing themselves. So what you get erupting along these lines are a sort of depoliticized response to the dog whistle word corruption. There is corruption across all our borders. I wish I could say more wonderful things about South Asia, and there are many wonderful things, but today's talk really is about disinformation. And one of the major tropes of disinformation that is used is one party or one political group calling another one corrupt and advocating its own uncorruptibility, when in truth, every single party has participated to some extent in corruption, almost none more so than the regimes currently in power. There is also, of course, a normalization of othering and violence, which we'll hear more about during the rest of the talk. Pakistan at present is to a certain extent swamped by COVID misinformation. And there's already been some excellent published work on this subject. Mohammed Shaban Rafi's excellent content analysis of COVID-19 related misinformation in Pakistan tells us much about the same kinds of medical misinformation that circulate in India and Bangladesh too, but has its own localized features, which of course are characterized by a kind of anti-Americanism, which is now hardwired into local politics there. And I'm sure you can't actually read some of these tweets, but most of them contain a series of conspiracy theories, which actually have made the rounds in the UK too, and so are not going to be unfamiliar to you, whichever country you find yourself viewing my talk from. And the idea that by spreading COVID misinformation, one is somehow being anti-imperialist is one which you will find in many of our South Asian contexts. And so a political stance is accompanied by disinformation, which goes across our porous electronic borders. There has been, alongside this kind of disinformation, a horrible media clampdown and harassment of journalists, which has increased over the years. So for instance, back in 2017 and 18, women journalists came together to voice their concerns about increasing online harassment in Pakistan and the pressure that mounted upon them from ruling party supporters towards anyone who had a politically differing viewpoint. And of course, this has come to a head now in the arrest and incarceration of various journalists. There has been an alarming surge of harassment of journalists who are simply calling attention to the facts around the pandemic, who are talking about deaths and death rates and hospitals and hospitalizations. So I know a lot of people say we're in a post-truth era. I find it more helpful simply to say that lies and politics still go hand in hand in many of our countries. Meanwhile, if we look at Sri Lanka, another major node for disinformation in South Asia, since the church bombings that killed 300 people and the ensuing anti-Muslim pogroms, which displaced and harmed many, many thousand, ties to the Buddhist far right have continued to proliferate on social media, and hate and misinformation with certain elements that are very similar to hate and misinformation in India have circulated. There is clearly evidence of social media's role in spreading misinformation and incitement to violence, and disinformation being so overwhelming, and you must imagine just how many pieces of evidence have to be gathered in order for this to happen, that Facebook actually found itself in the position of having to apologize. It rarely apologizes, except in Myanmar and Sri Lanka. It has very rarely done this. So Facebook's apology for its role in Sri Lanka's anti-Muslim riots really should have sparked a change, but this is already a year ago. And unfortunately, my contacts and colleagues in Sri Lanka tell me that what was happening then is happening at an accelerated pace and continuing now today. So disinformation has in no way stopped. It goes from platform to platform. It mutates from its Facebook form to its WhatsApp form. Images are morphed in each one, different languages are used and attached, different voiceovers, but the basic aims of that misinformation and connection to hate speech still seem to be underlying the same. Censorship, harassment, and murder of critical journalists in India has been on the rise. It simply would take too long for me to list to you the number of journalists in Kashmir who have been incarcerated or found themselves with FIRs, first information reports against them with the police. It's now clearly one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a critical journalist. If you don't find yourself killed under a dump truck because you were investigating a cement or sand mafia, you're likely to find yourself with a mob around your house if you reported accurately on an ongoing protest. In 2020 alone, dozens have been beaten, dead, or imprisoned, and hundreds gagged legally, and thousands silenced by their own institutions, by their editors who refuse to publish what they talk about. I speak at a moment when India is actually in the center, the very center of a storm around misinformation and disinformation. If you haven't heard this story, it's really worth finding out about it. A few days ago, Rihanna tweeted about the farmer protests in India. And her tweet was relatively uncontroversial in the sense that it asked, why aren't we talking about this? Could have been, she actually barely expressed a political opinion, although there was at the heart of it a desire for democratic discussion around protest and the right to protest. Following that, of course, as you can see in this screen, is Rihanna a Muslim began to become the top search in Google in India. And to those of you who don't know the history of anti-Muslim activism in India of the far right, the rest of the talk is going to focus quite a lot on why this might have been becoming a top search in India. Some of the tweets that she faced in the aftermath of her tweet were significantly anchored in a both anti-Black and misogynist frame of mind. So images of her from when she was physically abused by her previous partner were morphed and put around all over Twitter, all over Facebook, all over ShareChat. And time again, users were saying things like, well, he should have finished her off. She deserved what she got. Why didn't he do the job properly? Why did he just stop at that? And then there were, of course, questions about her being both Black and Muslim, which of course she isn't. So it's clear that fascist Hindutva groups in India, allied to the BJP, now colonize new media, both in India and in the diaspora. Hindutva trolls are vicious. They take no quarter on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and comment sections of online newspapers. Despite the current ban on TikTok, TikToks are still being made and uploaded with various types of misinformation on a number of different issues. And I'm going to talk now about our in-depth case study, WhatsApp Vigilantes, that we brought out towards the end of 2019, and which has only been confirmed by events which followed in February 2020 in Delhi, in the pogroms, and subsequently during the COVID outbreak, when disinformation became hard currency in regard to hospital places for patients from different communities, and particularly from the Muslim minority in India. So at present, India is seeing such a rise in vigilante violence that it's almost incomparable. A lot of people compare the current era to the one that India went through in the 1970s under the emergency. The difference, of course, is that under the emergency, it was primarily the state that was wreaking havoc and violence against its population. And it was a state that did not enjoy massive popularity. Unfortunately, despite the fact that many people will be critical of what's happening in India at the moment, India still has, and its ruling party and its government and its vigilantes still have massive support amongst ordinary citizens. And so we have a divided country, if you like, divided between groups of people for whom misinformation becomes completely legitimate, more because of their ideological perspective than because of any other aspect of their everyday life or experience. I want to take a step back, though, and try to explain why we, my team and I, became so interested in disinformation and misinformation circulating across borders in South Asia, why we were so interested in actually looking at the social media presence of disinformation. We were hearing a lot in 2018 to 2019 of people talking about vigilante violence and lynchings. There were more than 300 people dead by the time we came to do the report. An overwhelming majority of these incidents were taking place in states which were ruled by the BJP, and a majority of the victims were Muslim. There were also, in parallel, some really strange and very worrying developments with regard to stranger danger. So it's no surprise to us, those of us who grew up in the 70s, knew stranger danger in many forms. We were told about child kidnappers. We were told to be careful when we were coming home and going to school. But in the intervening decades, what has happened is that these kinds of rumors and anxieties have morphed into social media memes and GIFs and short films, which have now left more than 50 dead and hundreds injured due to false accusations of child kidnapping, which move incredibly swiftly. So within the space of 20 minutes, a group of 5 people who were tourists in an area and were passing through in a car and giving out sweets to children in a gesture of kindness ended up being attacked and several of them beaten to death in 2018. And so what we saw then was the increase in almost unidirectional violence. So it was against strangers by local crowds and mobs, many mobilized very swiftly on online platforms. And the kind of misinformation that we were seeing then has now been utilized along India's borders. Very, very quickly, although at first it appeared to be apolitical or depoliticized and to target just anybody, it's now being mobilized against what's known as infiltrators or Bangladeshis or anti-nationals or Rohingya. So we at the time saw it as a sort of depoliticized form of misinformation, which has now, of course, been deployed in political ways. And there's a connection between a history of political mob violence and this disinformation that we were seeing. So the debates that we were hearing of at the time were asking questions about why these kinds of rumors spread so quickly. And one of the answers that we were being given by different stakeholders, and one of the answers that were being given by governments and social media companies in particular, seemed to level the blame at rural India. It seemed to level the blame at those who were recent users of social media, recently acquired phones or connections, and who seemed to be the ones who had no understanding or conception of the kind of dangers of disinformation. We were told on multiple occasions when we asked the question, why aren't the social media companies doing more, that social media companies were indeed doing a lot to raise alertness amongst populations and media literacy. And so media literacy, that is an ability to check a forward, to do a reverse image search and such like, and to check whether something you received on social media was also in the mainstream media. That emerged as the #1 strategy for a lot of organizations in the face of this overwhelming violence. So rather than asking the question, why are there other countries in which there is disinformation, but it has not erupted into a violence? And what's the difference between South Asian countries where something as simple as a street vendor looking at a religious text in public and being photographed doing so can escalate into a lynch mob within minutes? Instead of asking those kinds of questions, we were being told that it is people who can only understand images and don't read, it's the illiterate and the rural users who are somehow responsible for this rise, this extreme rise in violence connected to social media misinformation. Still, on the way towards formulating our questions and our understanding of the social media ecology, which was making up this misinformation, we wanted to look at what was happening in the political economy of media, in the political economy of phones and communications in India around the time. So of course, what you have is the entry of Reliance Jio into the market in 2016. And this could probably be an international case study in the sense that it has seen the most phenomenal rise. So cutting through the market like a knife through butter would not be an overstatement for what Reliance Jio has become. So with now 404 million subscribers approximately, it is now the largest market share. So it's overtaken multiple other companies. And alongside that, what you've seen is a deliberate undermining of the government's own provider, BSNL, by multiple different strategies from both private and public sectors. And so you have BSNL cutting jobs, you have infrastructure breaking down, whereas with Reliance Jio, you've got incredibly cheap data, you've got it being pushed everywhere, you've got ads with members of the ruling party and the prime minister on them, you've got apps preloaded on your phone which are connected to local political parties, particularly to the BJP, you've got a whole range of subsidies being given, taken out, of course, from other budgets, and India is not doing so well in the economy at the moment. WhatsApp, of course, alongside this, is trying to make its own adjustments. So its master company, Facebook, is adjusting itself into the Indian market, inserting itself into the Indian market through WhatsApp, alongside Facebook, alongside Instagram, all of which are highly popular with Indian users, and now has approximately between 350 and 400 million users in India, according to its own records. And although there are a wide number of apps and platforms that are also heavily used, which aren't owned, for instance, by Facebook, TikTok, and ShareChat and Zapier, still WhatsApp, because of its end-to-end encryption, at least until 2 months ago, was the app of choice for social media users. Smartphones and app usage, of course, is sharply gendered, and I haven't talked here, and I won't talk today, about many of the things we found to do with women and girls and misogyny in WhatsApp, because it doesn't relate as clearly and closely to disinformation. But it's really important, really relevant to our talk today, to understand the gendered context of WhatsApp usage, in the sense that many women and girls have only surveilled access to WhatsApp. In many rural areas, you will find that it's a man who controls the smartphone, and that a woman genuinely only checks once a day, or maybe never, the WhatsApp messages of the groups that she belongs to. So in that as a backdrop, that women have far less access to it than men do, except in some upper middle class and middle class circles in cities, it's really interesting to do a methodological qualitative study, as we did, in which we talked to multiple different users. So we spoke in depth with approximately 275 WhatsApp users through 65 in-depth interviews, 20 extended focus group discussions, and 10 expert interviews across the states of Karnataka, Maharashtra, Uttar Pradesh, and Madhya Pradesh, which broadly represent a cross-section of the country. WhatsApp users that we encountered were between 18 and 45 years old. Some were a few. We had a few 60 plus, men and women. We tried as far as possible to get equal numbers into our groups. They were rural, semi-urban, and urban. And we also looked across caste, class, and religion. We asked them in our initial approaches to forward us the sorts of WhatsApp forwards and messages that they were receiving on a daily basis and that they were forwarding. And we did this through an ethically well-checked mechanism where they deleted all metadata, and if any was left on, we deleted it, so that what we were not interested in doing, and what was not our role at the time, was to focus on those who were sending the misinformation to our users. We were actually really interested in understanding whether they forwarded or not, and why they forwarded any form of disinformation or misinformation. And I think this has much wider relevance in the US, particularly around issues to do with the storming of the Capitol that took place a few weeks ago. So the political communicative context of what we were looking at was really fascinating. And I'm going to talk a little about the strategies that we noted. Particularly, one thing struck us at the beginning of our analysis of the text messages that we were getting, that we were seeing a single narrative across multiple different sites. So we would check the narrative and see it on a WhatsApp message. But these WhatsApp message narratives were also in tandem with ideas, tropes, messages, and stereotypes, which were circulated far more widely in the public domain. So for instance, we might see it on a mainstream media news show. We would also see it in the newspapers. We would also see the same image or same idea circulated on ShareChat. We would see it circulated on TikTok. We would see it circulated on Twitter. And time and again, what we were finding was that users told us that they were media literate. Users were claiming to us, and it seemed to be a badge of honor, that they understood how to verify things. They would say, I carefully checked this. I went to X channel to see. And therefore, when they saw the same thing on a mainstream or supposedly mainstream media channel, they then let go of their skepticism, or else moved towards skepticism of all sources. So there was a kind of polarizing effect, but more towards a letting go of skepticism. And people who said, oh, I'm very media literate, I can do this, I can do that, I can make a podcast, I can make a vodcast, were the people who were also telling us, we forwarded this piece of what we know to be misinformation or disinformation. Mainstream TV news contained such a plethora of hate speech and perpetuated so many stereotypes at the time that we were doing our analysis, that all the researchers who were doing the analysis actually could say, hand on heart, that we were seeing incitement to violence on a daily basis. And that this, of course, was infiltrating every one of the WhatsApp groups that we were analyzing and all the forwards that we were sent. There was a large amount of intertextuality. So if you add transmediality, the single narrative across multiple sites, to intertextuality, which is the editing of various TV clips or fan pages or content from multiple genres in ways which appeared to make it into news or sensational news, we were seeing something quite frightening. So you'd have a Hollywood style or Bollywood style sequence played out with either no commentary verbally or a voiceover, which gave it a completely false meaning. So you had misinformation about who had crossed which border, about what armies were doing, about what particular police forces had done, about who was an aggressor in a situation, about which community a woman belonged to, about what was going on when you saw multiple people putting their hands out and touching a woman. What had happened often was that part of a train accident had been clipped out, and so what looked to be an attack was actually people giving assistance to someone. There were many, many ways of disguising disinformation and misinformation in what we looked at. I put here a trigger warning because the next page contains a piece of disinformation, which we've taken from the report, Equality Lab's report. As we were doing our work, we were not the only ones interested in disinformation and misinformation. Obviously, there were a large number of other scholarly teams, some very, very highly respected groups doing work on similar kinds of issues, particularly around hate speech. And here you have an example that we picked up from their report. It's from someone to someone else, talking to multiple people on Facebook, saying that Rohingya jihadis have been doing only two things in Burma for the last 70 years, burning villages and gang raping women. This was the sort, and this is very minor compared to the things we saw. Then, of course, you have hate speech. There is only one way to deal with cockroaches: trample them under your chappal. Now, I particularly picked out this one from their report because Facebook are currently revising their hate speech guidelines. And I think it's really important with regard to misinformation to talk about how policies can be related to what happens with regard to misinformation. And a lot of the groups that we talk to in WhatsApp and Facebook often have very well-meaning people there, including well-meaning in the sense that they would absolutely hate to know that their apps or work were being used to facilitate pogroms and genocide. And yet that is a fact. That's what's actually happening. And so they try, through rehearsing language and changing the nuances of language, to do something that is almost impossible. So there you have a second, if you like, theory about how one might prevent misinformation or disinformation through making people policy aware. And yet we can tell you with almost certainty that however brilliant a policy is, unless there is some form of commitment to it, both from the populace and from the government, you're going to find that the policy fails. And so they can rewrite their policy, but there are problems with that. And I'll come to that towards the end of the talk. Disinformation, we found, was used as a form of targeted violence, particularly amongst certain urban and rural caste Hindu groups. And that came across very clearly in the interviews. And this comes from their own words, from what they said and what they told us about what they do. There was widespread distrust, hatred, contempt, and suspicion towards Muslims, Dalits, Pakistanis, and critical dissenting citizens. I'll say here as a disclaimer, there is no doubt very similar forms of distrust, hatred, and contempt towards other groups in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, and so on and so forth. So it is simply that, not simply that we want to pick on India. It is really important to understand that in India mirrors certain contexts which are happening across South Asia. Humanitarian opinions, particularly those that are critical of actions of the Indian government or the Indian army, or Hindutva or the BJP, lead to vicious online bullying and offline consequences, police complaints about sedition or physical violence. Merely asking a question such as, could this be fake news or misinformation in a WhatsApp group which has an ideological hegemony of those who are suspicious towards the others described above, can lead to either being physically trolled and bullied or trolled and bullied off the group. So affective elements around emotion are very, very strong in these WhatsApp messages and make them stand out from the flow of everyday contexts, the good mornings, good afternoons, and have a coffee kind of messages that you might get. As journalist Rana Ayub has pointed out, she has been the target of a systematic campaign of disinformation, both about her person and about her work, ever since she published her book, looking at the anatomy of the Gujarat riots in 2002. So our work then centered on making a typology, both of the users and forwarders of misinformation and disinformation, and of the kinds of things that they were forwarding. And this is all available free online in our report, WhatsApp Vigilantes, but I will just outline some of the things that we found. In amongst a steady flow of overwhelming content, there were lots of things around accidents. There were lots of violent images of people whose limbs had been cut, whose faces were beaten, where blood was pouring out from wounds. And this kind of overwhelming, compelling content also created a sense that the mainstream news was not showing users everything that happened, that somehow the mainstream media was hiding things. There was a very strong ethno-nationalist and ethno-religious bigotry in the messages that we saw forwarded. Majority communities were constantly talking about their own victimhood. And I say, of course, here, false victimhood, because there was absolutely no evidence anywhere, either through sociological studies or through studies of the media, that any of these narratives of victimhood were true in any sense. And this was used as a way of whipping up physical violence against minorities and dissenters. There were religious themes amongst the messages that we analyzed, particularly reinforcing membership of exclusive religious communities. And we wouldn't have classified this as disinformation if it didn't include strange illusions about historical superiority or biological superiority and modes of explaining daily life. So for instance, the disinformation in the COVID era, both in India and Pakistan, often links COVID to groups who are also being othered for other religious reasons. Gender and misogyny were high on the list of the kinds of things that people did, and they often intersected with religious themes or ethno-nationalism. So for instance, I removed today, and I didn't show it, but there were several really quite vicious rape memes showing a handsome Indian male soldier type raping a woman draped in the Pakistani flag, for instance, and it was being used as a sort of beautiful and victorious message. It was deeply, deeply worrying. And of course, in real life, many women have actually been driven to suicide by the kinds of things circulating to their groups about them. Miscellaneous content also provides a continuous flow of sensational headlines and ideological headlines, with raw material crossing over from cross-border attacks and attacks on TikTok, and people saying women are about to be raped in your area, or this Muslim infidel has published such and such online, this pamphlet, we need to get this person. It's a constant flow. And I think that constant flow is something that we have to be very aware of when it comes to disinformation, because it's much harder to stop, pause, take a deep breath, make a complaint, follow it through, if you're then receiving 200 more WhatsApp forwards in the space of 24 hours, which you also have to look at and examine. But the second point to make about this constant flow is that it is frequently framed in language which used to be language used by intellectuals on the left. It used to be used by those who followed the Gramscian tradition and talked about hegemony. So often these WhatsApp forwards about the ruling party and about Hindus needing to defend themselves in India are framed as resistance to a liberal hegemony and to terrorism. And there's a striking continuity between visual misinformation, propaganda, and resistant action in every single one of the different fields that we looked at. So be it on the mainstream news, be it in Hindi films or Telugu cinema, be it in TikTok videos, or be it in full page ads taken out in the Times of India, you will find the same sorts of visual imagery repeated again and again. So this brings us to the user motivations for forwarding these kinds of pieces of misinformation and disinformation. We found that young and middle-aged users experience the effects of the emotional labor. They almost talked to us as if going through their WhatsApp forwards or going through their WhatsApp messages was work, a full-time job for them. And this, they almost felt entitled them to a certain kind of acclaim amongst others in their group. So forwarding, deleting messages, being re-added to groups even after you've left, often creates a sense of exhaustion amongst users. A section of users who share misinformation out of a need to be perceived as a civic resource. So we spoke to several I might term them as community uncles or community aunties, who would say things like, I am the person everyone comes to first, or I've always been the one who knows. They depend on me to give them the first news on such and such. We have mainstream media who won't tell us anything, therefore I need to be on the alert for this. Others, of course, claim to share misinformation out of a sense of civic duty. They'll tell you things such as, now is not the time to question, our country needs us. Even if there was some doubt about X, Y, or Z, I would be unpatriotic if I asked that question. It was really important. I was safeguarding my religious community by doing this. Even if X person didn't actually rape a Hindu woman at such and such a time, I know that others have done so, therefore it's not false to spread this information about them, and so on and so forth. We had these kinds of really in-depth, really extended conversations with people where they, in their own words, told us why they were sharing misinformation. Misinformation, of course, closely follows ideological, family, and community ties. And many of these people, and we really want to emphasize that, shared misinformation precisely because they said they had familiarity and trust in the people who were forwarding it. And they found that it would be disrespectful to X or Y person in their social circle if they did not forward such and such a piece. It would be a doubting of their legitimacy. And so this kind of ideological nexus between people within family groups and neighborhood groups definitely falling along religious and caste lines, and mainly, of course, falling in line with a high caste Hindu and male grouping, was something that we saw followed through in our typology of users who spread misinformation and disinformation. So misinformation spreads largely due to ideology and prejudice rather than to ignorance or illiteracy. That was one of the biggest findings. It's of course been contested. It would be contested because it itself in a way is a kind of ideological finding to say that people spread misinformation for these reasons. It does not align with many of the experiment-based ways in which people talk about misinformation and disinformation, but political misinformation particularly, which is the one we are looking at, spreads largely due to ideology and prejudice. Highly media literate users, people who can make TikToks, people who can upload vodcasts and podcasts, largely upper caste, highly educated, urban Hindu men, and sometimes urban Hindu women, who seem to be more likely to play a large role in creating and forwarding disinformation, told us this themselves, even administering groups to spread disinformation. And they often spread this against other groups such as Dalits or Muslims, particularly in the educational sector. The anti-reservation kinds of groups are very strong. So it was very rare that we found the groups who were the targets to be making or spreading any kind of disinformation. And yet frequently a whole host of so-called fact checkers have been put out even by the Hindu far right. And those fact checkers will label fake news anyone actually commenting on their disinformation. So if you happen to call out a piece of disinformation, which is put out about a minority community, you will immediately be labeled as having said fake news. And of course, Trump came along and used the strategy repeatedly in the US. So child kidnapping related incidents which rely on users with a general mistrust of strangers and an affinity towards the sender of the message and extreme trust in the group, these senders were overwhelmingly male. Although a few women do share these concerns and sometimes shield the perpetrators, we found that the mobs too were overwhelmingly male. So this is not a happy story. This is a grim story about citizenship. This is a grim story about democracy. And corporate tech companies have all along the way colluded with the Indian government. In 2020, it was only a matter of time before the Wall Street Journal broke their story of how Anki Das, the then head of Facebook India, told her team to ignore anti-Muslim hate speech and to continue to allow hateful posts by the BJP. This was something that was corroborated by multiple different sources. There were sources, journalistic sources, who had been to the Facebook headquarters in India and seen their Hindutva propaganda even emblazoned above the door of the offices. So the temple will be built right here is a phrase, a known Hindu right phrase, which has circulated and was also on a banner or a poster above the Facebook offices. Anki Das is known to have herself posted hateful disinformation. So we are here coming full circle. The very corporate tech companies, the heads, the intelligent, educated, highly esteemed, well-paid people who were claiming that it is rural users, that it is people who only have very low levels of literacy, who don't know how to do this, that, or the other, who are forwarding, are themselves implicated in very violent, very disagreeable disinformation and misinformation. So we come to some solutions. Well, the first thing to say is media literacy simply isn't the solution if it's simply technical or sort of media literacy. It's simply not good enough to be able to know how to do things, how to delete things, how to report things. It needs to be allied to a very critical sense. In India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, misinformation and disinformation disproportionately affect lower and working class people, and lower castes, women and LGBT, Muslims and Christians. This is, of course, now also being extended to farmers and Sikhs who are protesting about things happening in India. There's a need to build a critical media literacy allied to human rights literacy and political literacy in order to break cycles of prejudice. This is not going to happen by tweaking the app. I can't tell you how many times we keep hearing the techno people telling us, okay, we'll make this tweak, or that algorithm can be changed, or we can ensure that so-and-so can only forward to 3 people. This does not work. It may slow things down, but ultimately it doesn't work because people are so techno-literate in India. They are the arch hackers, and they're able to hack both software and hardware. They're able to use old versions of things, and they simply bypass all of these little techno tweaks in order to forward misinformation in major ways to large numbers of people. We need to educate people about how media representations legitimize discrimination and violence around caste, gender, class, and religion in all South Asian countries, and educate people about the complexities involved in balancing freedom of speech, the role of automation and social infrastructures in curating and distributing information, user privacy, and the right to life. If we don't do this, then we are going to remain in the place where we are now, seeing an escalation of violence against particular communities. And finally, I think it's really, really important that we teach about the influence and tie-ups between private corporations, profit motives, and political actors and political motives across borders. So why, for instance, going back to the beginning of my talk, is there such a synergy between disinformation against Muslims in Sri Lanka, who had for many years lived very peacefully side by side with the Sinhala Buddhist communities, and a tie-up with the far-right RSS rhetoric in India? And this kind of thing, the ways in which authoritarian groups and regimes learn from each other and use disinformation online is something that needs to be investigated at length. I'm going to stop there and hopefully leave enough time for us to have some questions. Thank you very much. Dr. Kelly.
Hello. That was, wow, really powerful. I was looking through the comments and the questions coming in from YouTube, and we've got a few for you, Dr. Banerjee. How do you think we can, the first being, how do you think we can approach the study of labor of disinformation? As this has two aspects of labor, one of labor of creation message and the other of consumption and sharing.
So that's a super interesting question. And I think two things have to be said. One is that some of the people that we talk to disavow their labor in this, and those are generally the people who are most implicated in a systematic construction, production and circulation of disinformation and misinformation in any or all of the South Asian countries we're talking about. So just to be very precise, what has come to be termed troll farms, what has come to be termed troll armies in Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan, particularly those which have connections to political parties. The people that you meet from there fall into two categories. One, they will either say it's just a job, and we have interviewed, not many, but a few people like that, and we know journalists who've also interviewed people like that, who will say it's just a job. I don't ideologically believe what I'm doing, but it pays a good wage, and they'll use their degrees from MIT and IIT and other places, which are as evidence of their specialism and technique. And they'll say, well, if it really is so bad, maybe I should go and work for someone else. I probably will. This is just a stopgap. I'm 23 or I'm 28 and I'm going to get married soon, and then I'll stop doing this. So there's a kind of disavowal of the damage, the harm, and the hurt. And that labor is categorized simply as it's just a job. And then there are the ones who disavow the labor. And they say, how dare you call us trolls? While trolling me, while trolling my colleagues who work on these areas, they will say, we're not trolls. We genuinely, we are believers. We are supporters. We love this group, this party, these people. We love our nation. We love India. We love Pakistan. We're doing this for the love of, of Islam, of the Prophet, of the book, or what have you. And the labor of love is much harder to pin down and talk about. What do you do with those people who are both producers and circulators, who may or may not have paid connections, may or may not have ideological stakes in power, but clearly are part of an ecosystem in which without that labor, there would be fewer deaths. Without that labor, there would be less discrimination. Without the effort they were putting in, someone somewhere would not have died on a particular night. And I think those two types of labor and those two types of people need to be studied both separately and together. And I know some young scholars, really promising, amazing young scholars, who want to do both of those things, who are setting out to. I know some young journalists in India particularly, but also in Sri Lanka, who have been working on and working with these kinds of people to understand their mindsets and to understand the role that the notion of payment and the notion of civic duty play in both of these types of labor.
Thank you, Dr. Banerjee. Another question. What are the main countervailing forces pushing back against misinformation and disinformation?
That's such a great question. So I think I briefly touched on in my talk policymakers. There are people who are trying to write policies which will be so watertight that they will capture, while they're global policies, that they will capture local events and local things. And those people, again, are not necessarily bad people. Many of them are well-meaning. Many of them are well-informed and, in fact, bright people doing this. But what they are not doing at the same time is challenging their own institutions and asking the institution whether its commitment overall is to stopping misinformation or allowing misinformation for some reason. And they're not challenging it until something happens. Like, let me take the example of what recently happened to a very well-known and sort of responsible academic, Timnit Gebru, at Google, when she blew the whistle, so to speak, on a situation of racism and misogyny and bullying taking place within Google, and was then swiftly removed from the company. And so what you have is, if someone calls a company to account, calls one of these big tech firms to account for disinformation, then those people tend to get removed from their jobs. And therefore, in fear or in sort of cynicism or knowledge of this, many people make policies, make very good policies, but ultimately those policies fall flat or they fail. So there are people at the policy level trying to do something. There are people at the policy level working with governments to try to do something. But imagine working with the current Indian government to try and stop misinformation when the government itself is generating such, absolute enormous amounts of disinformation and misinformation on a daily basis about everything. I mean, literally about everything, from the production of a vaccine to the fiscal deficit to human beings and human trafficking and what have you. So it's a very complex one to push back. And then, of course, there are groups of citizens, like incredible, brave people, feminist groups, Dalit groups, secular groups, human rights groups, individuals, people working for the media, individual investigative journalists in Kashmir who are trying to document things and make databases, journalists in Sri Lanka who've been logging anti-Tamil hate and logging sort of genocidal speeches on and offline for a decade now. And these people are just, I cannot tell you how much they are pushing back against disinformation, but they are part of an ecosystem which is set up to discredit them. And if not to discredit them, then to intimidate them and to prevent them from doing what they've set out to do. And so it is the job, I would have thought, of international organizations, of international scholarly colleagues, and of big rights groups internationally to step in and step up for supporting these people. And in a small way, and ironically, the Rihanna tweet has done precisely that around now. But this is by far not the first or worst of the violent ways that protesters in India have been treated over the last 5 years. And so disinformation about protest and about democratic rights is rife and needs to be countered, whether it comes from very, very significant markets or not.
Thank you, Dr. Banerjee. We have a lot of questions actually remaining, but due to time, I'm going to go ahead and invite Rebecca back to join us, and we'll close this session. What a powerful time it's been with you this morning. Thank you.
Thank
Rebecca.
you very much.
Yes, thank you so much. That was excellent. Very informative, really important right now. Absolutely relevant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Excuse me. I do want to say to the YouTube crowd, stay tuned for our next panel. In 15 minutes, we'll have a feature film showcase and presentation by Dr. Harjant Gill. Those of you that are currently in the panel, feel free to log out from Zoom at this time, and you are encouraged to continue watching on YouTube.